So if you remember, last Wednesday, we were talking about, we did an introduction to developmental psychology. And just as a review, we went through and we talked about different developmental issues that we should discuss. We talked about the different age groups that we're going to consider in this time period. And then we talked about the different cognitive, biological, and socio-emotional processes that human development researchers really look into, or what are called developmental psychologists. And then we started in talking a little bit about biological processes, which we'll get to more in a little while. But then we started with one of the first kind of developmental theories, which was Sigmund Freud's. And we kind of did a refresher about what Freud's theory is from the beginning of the semester. Remember that it is a largely unconscious theory, that he believed that most of our mental life, most of our behaviors are explained by unconscious, not conscious decision making. And it's driven by two really primitive drives, sex and aggression. And I'll say that later theorists kind of changed. They de-emphasized sexuality and looked at things like drives for dominance, drives for control, those kinds of things. But we're really talking about Freud's very basic theory, because he also was one of the first to give us a developmental theory of at least childhood. And as I mentioned last Wednesday, he set some bars for some things. One in developmental psychology, a lot of the literature focuses on 0 to 18, because it was Freud who said that we stop developing at the age of 18 and we have all of our capacities. After that, it's only been in about the last 50 to 60 years, well, maybe 60 to 70 years now, that we recognize that people develop well beyond the age of 18 and well into later adulthood. The other thing that he did provide us is a stage theory that introduces the idea that during certain age groups or certain periods of life, there are certain things that we go through physically, socio-emotionally, and cognitively. And if we get successfully through that stage, it determines our success in the next stage, if nothing else in our life changes, okay? And on Wednesday, we introduced the first two phases, which were the oral and anal phase. And we looked at some of the influences Freud has had on popular culture. So we talked about his idea that people who are orally fixated, this is what they end up consuming a lot. I mentioned that he actually died of mouth cancer because he smoked cigars almost every day from the age of 12 on. But he also made the popular assumption that obesity and those types of things are caused by overconsumption, which is actually a false thing, even though it's definitely promoted in our multi-million-dollar diet industry and even among a lot of physicians still today. Then we introduced the idea of anal and the anal phase, and we talked about the potty training and how that's a kind of an important developmental phase, and he didn't get that one wrong. But it emphasizes the idea of someone who, because they couldn't take internal control of themselves, they take excessive control over their environment. And so today in popular culture, when we tell someone they're being anal, we're really using this Freudian notion that they had trouble during this age of 2 to 4. We stopped our discussion and started talking about the phallic stage of development. And hold on just a second. I do need to. How are you doing? Okay. All right, let's try this again. Sorry, we're having some audio problems. Okay, that's still recording. All right, there we go. All right, I think we're ready now. All right, we left off to finish with what was called the phallic phase of his developmental theory. Now, to kind of explain the phallic phase, remember we're dealing with areas of the body that bring certain sensations. So one starts with feeding, the other is then control over one's bodily functions. And in this stage now, we recognize that everybody has a body, and in that body there's certain places with bundles of nerves that turn off sensation areas and pleasure areas in the brain. Okay, for boys that area tends to be the penis, and for women that tends to be the clitoris. And it is very common to find children, when they found these bundles of nerves, to start touching them. And indeed, in modern research, we see children in mom's wombs who are what we call masturbating. But I want to make something very clear. There's a difference between childhood masturbation and adult masturbation. Childhood masturbation is when a child realizes that certain parts of their body, when they touch it, it feels really good. Okay. That's childhood masturbation, and almost every child does it. Adult masturbation is when a person touches parts of their body. For men, it's the penis, and for women, it's the vagina and clitoris, while fantasizing about a sex object. Okay, so there's a difference between childhood and adult. And this is kind of a good place to kind of stop to talk about things like childhood sexuality, if children are potentially being molested or groomed, because very often moms and dads walk in the room and find their child masturbating. And a very important question that parents should ask is why are you doing that? And if the child just says it feels good, then they're probably just doing what is natural. Okay. But if they start saying things like, well, Uncle Joey showed me, or I learned this from, or I watched it with, or it's been done to me, and that's how they learned about that, that's when you have to be concerned as a parent. And so it's a good thing, to know, but it's also important to understand that this is also an opportunity to talk about human sexuality. I know this sounds counterintuitive to a lot of the morals and whatnot that we have in the dominant culture here in the United States. But the earlier you start talking to a child about sexuality in a developmentally appropriate way, okay, the more likely they will withhold having sex until later age, and the less likely they'll be willing to enter into high-risk sexual activities at a younger age. In fact, what we find is that parents who are actually open about sexuality, again, developmentally appropriately, and an appropriate conversation with children, that children don't have all those questions they start to have when they go through puberty, and are less likely to enter into high-risk behaviors. Okay. Did I tell the story of Pockets in here, the little girl? I don't think so. And another thing just to keep in mind while we're on the parenting topics is when I worked with children who were sexually abused, one thing that abusers use is parents' fears about their children's bodies. And one of the most common fears parents have is telling their children what their sexual parts are, okay? And a lot of offenders will play on this. So a lot of parents will name their children's private parts, a cutie or the teddy bear or some ridiculous name, okay? And offenders play on that. And what I would encourage anyone who is a parent or is going to be a parent, name body parts for what they are. A penis is a penis, a vagina is a vagina, nothing else. And I'm going to tell you the story why, because the story it was something that was just so common and that I heard over and over and over when working with children who were sexually abused, okay? A mom divorced her husband, and they had a little girl who was, I can't remember now, 4 or 5 years old. She was in preschool. And the dad kind of became an absent dad. And so the mother had to get a job. And her child's aunt and uncle, her sister and brother-in-law said that they could take care of her, okay? Well, some time passed, and she started getting notes from the school saying that she was acting out, she was acting strange, her grades were going down. And then someday she started to come home and she started saying, Uncle, I'm changing his name, Joe, is putting his hands in my pockets. Now the region that we're coming from is cold, so she was wearing coats. And so, no one would think of, well, what does pockets mean, right? But she kept coming home and kept saying, Uncle Joe's putting his hands in my pockets. And mom would ask, well, what's he getting out of it? And she goes, I don't know. I don't know what's in my pockets. And this went on for weeks and weeks and weeks. And one night, the little girl was taking a bath, and the mom was leaving the bathroom, and she said, okay, sweetheart, please make sure you wash your pockets really good. And she had a light bulb moment where she realized that the cute name that she gave her daughter's body parts were pockets, and realized that her brother-in-law was molesting her daughter by putting his hands in her actual vagina, okay? Now, I'm telling this story, and I hope it's not a trigger for anybody, but it's an emphasis point at this point. Offenders use parents' insecurity about talking about human sexuality to offend young children. And so this piece of soapbox advice is, and I've heard the story hundreds and hundreds of times, a penis is a penis and a vagina is a vagina. That's the names. And when you're nervous about it and scared about it, trust me, someone else won't be nervous to use those cute names we give children. So, okay, off my soapbox. All right, but during this phase, what Freud was getting at was he explained something called the Oedipus complex. Okay, Oedipus is a Greek kind of legend who, in the story, he killed his father to have unknowingly though, had sexual relationships with his mother. Okay, and what Freud suggested at this time is that boys during this time want to gain access to the one person that has shown them true love and kindness through their whole life, and that's the mother. And the young boy recognizes that dad is the barrier, but dad also gets most of her love and affection. So that the boy starts to mimic father's behaviors in order to, and this is Freudian terms, in order to replace the father to have sexual favors with the mother, okay? All right, later on, Carl Jung is going to add the Electra complex, okay? And for girls, what Carl Jung, who is the predecessor of Freud, is going to argue is that girls recognize that their dads have something they don't. And that something is his penis. And so what girls go through is what's called penis envy. And they realize that the person who, again, has access to that is the mother. And so in order to gain access to the father, she starts to mimic the behaviors of the mother, again, to replace the mother to have access to her fathers. And if she doesn't do this, she goes through what Carl Jung called castration anxiety. All right. That's the weirdness of Freud on this end. And it does sound very strange that a young boy at the age of 4 would want to replace his father for his mother, and the girl would do the opposite to gain access to her father. But what, again, remember what I said, Freud had to make his theory sexual in nature because of his theory that he already created, okay? But what was maybe Freud actually getting to based on modern research, okay, is that we have had a lot of times now since we've had I shouldn't say good, high divorce rates starting in around the 1960s into the 1970s. And we've had at least some samples of individuals where the mother has raised her young boy but has denied the boy any access to any male role models, such as a healthy boyfriend or a new stepfather or a healthy uncle or grandfather. And we also have a good enough sample of fathers who have raised their daughters and denied them access to a role model, such as a girlfriend or a stepmother or a aunt or a grandmother, okay? Most of these individuals did this because of, their experience with the opposite sex. And so they did it to kind of protect their kids, okay? So there is those confounding issues. But what have we found is that boys who are raised just by their mothers have extremely difficult times in intimate relationships in adulthood. And girls raised just by their fathers have extremely difficult times in relationships as adult women, okay? And we think this has to do with this unique period of time. In fact, we should probably go about the age of 2.5. Whoa. And we should go to at least about the age of 8 in this time period, because children are getting into a specific type of play during this group. And it's called kind of role-playing play, okay? Meaning what they're doing is they're looking at adults in their life. So they're looking at moms and dads, they're looking at doctors and teachers, they're looking at TV things like Superman and Superwoman and those people. And what they do in play is they take those roles on and they try them on. Okay, so this is where, a little boy, they play house, or they play doctor, or they play firefighter, or they play cops, and what they're doing is they're taking on adult roles and realizing, one, how those adult roles work and which one fits for them both. In fact, we know that doing this type of play around the age of 4 is the best predictor of someone's future career or whether they're going to go to college and the like. It's this age period where they've done enough role playing that they kind of have their life trajectory. Now, that's not the only thing that predicts it. There's other life events that can alter it or change it, but this seems to be one of the best predictors of whether someone goes to college or not. Okay. And what we've realized is that regardless of the sexual orientation of boys and girls, regardless of any of those types of gender issues, boys and girls need both male and female role models during this age group to understand how adults interact and then to play that out. Okay. And we think, despite the weird Oedipus complex and Electra complex, that's really what Freud was getting at. That it's important for children to play these adult roles, not sexually. Let's get that off the plate, but to role play the interactions of adults and to really learn what those are about. But that is the phallic phase, okay? The next phase of Freud's theory is another kind of, unfortunately, regret phase in developmental theory, because what he thought was from about the age of 6 to puberty, that we go to a latent period, meaning that nothing really developmentally occurs during this period between about the age of 6 and puberty. So unfortunately, while we're exploring this, a lot of other theorists will take this on. And if in child development, if there's a age group that has been neglected, it's the 6 to puberty age. And we will see that when we get to this age group, a lot of the research in this area comes from elementary schools and those types of things, from teachers. But unfortunately, it didn't get as much attention as the 0 to 6, and then the puberty to about age 18 stage. But Freud believed that this was just a latent period of learning basic skills that you learn in school and the like, okay? The last phase, according to Freud, is when we go through puberty and we gain our physical adult bodies. We go through the genital phase. And then in the genital phase is when we learn about appropriate adult sexuality. And we learn about, what it means within our culture and society areas and the like. I should go back to the phallic phase, though, because I realized I didn't state what Freud believed what happens if someone gets stuck in the phallic phase. Okay, if you think about what's going on in the phallic phase, you're really stimulating probably the most stimulation part of your body. Okay, dopamine, which is the same drug that is affected by methamphetamine, okay, and cocaine. Is what responds to the stimulation of the genital areas. In fact, the highest amount of dopamine humans can produce naturally is when humans are having an orgasm, okay? Now, if you're ever wondering why methamphetamine is so addictive, the amount of dopamine that is produced from a hit of phetamine is about 3 to 4 times the hit you get from a natural orgasm. And that's why it's so addictive, okay? And so that, but what he believed is that, if you think dopamine, it's a pleasure stimulant, is that people who are stuck in the phallic phase tend to be sensation seekers. They always need constant stimulation. This is a person who becomes obsessive compulsive about things. This is a person who becomes needs to have constant physical thrill in their life. Okay, and so that's when someone gets stuck in that phallic phase, they become thrill seekers, according to Freud. On the cultural level, when you call a boy a mama's boy, or when you call a girl a daddy's girl, or lack thereof in either context, this is going back, you're actually being weird like Freud was, because this is what you're suggesting, is that the boy was stuck and is stuck needing that sexual relationship with the mother. When you call a boy a mommy's boy, and you're telling a girl that she's stuck in the sexual young relationship with her father when you call a girl a daddy's girl. So just keep that in mind when you're using that nomenclature, that it actually comes from these origins of sexuality with the parent, which we can talk about later when we get to human sexuality. But that's kind of where that popular culture of the mommy's boy and the daddy's girl comes from. So, all right. Then the latent phase, there's not really anything you can get stuck in the latent phase because nothing really is happening. People who get stuck in the genital phase are ones that end up having sexual dysfunctions. So either they can't perform sexually or they're hypersexual. So he would argue that this explains someone who has excessive masturbation issues. This is someone who might become a rapist, for example, okay? Now, this is going to have an interesting impact on mental health, okay? Because so here in the United States, the first mental health hospital that was built, and the first mental hospital that was built in the Europeans, which where they originated, and then we took them on, the very first patients in both of those hospitals were hospitalized for excessive masturbation. In fact, that was one of the most common diagnoses that individuals who were put in mental asylums would have for males, okay? And it comes back from one, Freud's idea that they must be stuck in this phase, and two, at the time, it was a very sexually repressed society. And we'll learn in the abnormal psychology section, what's defined as abnormal and sometimes mental illness is defined by your society and your culture at the time. So back then, it was very sexually repressed. And so that's one reason, or one of the most common reasons people were admitted to mental asylums in the beginning of mental asylums. But we see these trends always continue. So for example, homosexuality, being gay or lesbian, was just taken out of the diagnostic manual in 1999, meaning that before 1999, so this is only 23 years ago, before 1999, if you were homosexual, gay, or lesbian, you were diagnosed with a mental disorder and had diagnoses if you were revealed that to your physician or your counselor, because it was considered a mental illness prior 1999. It wasn't until after that they took it out of the DSM due to more progressive types of research. So we see we've come quite a ways in the last 23 years now that same-sex relationships have become more acceptable and whatnot. But now really when it comes to the sexual disorders, there's basically two. There's compulsive disorders, so people who are over sexualized and they're not able to do their job or get sleep or anything without that, or people who are they themselves confused about their identity, both gender and sexually. And we will still help people who are confused, but the idea of just being gay or just being lesbian is no longer considered a disease or a disorder. So that's just a note on the progression of society. And it was kind of Freud's notion in this genital phase that this is what creates a lot of mental illness, okay? All right, so that's Freud, and what should we take from it? We should take that we do know that in the developmental period of at least 2 to 5, that exposure to, but not in a sexual nature, to genders and to role models is important, okay? We should take that a lot of our popular culture notions of for example, our notions about obesity and our notions about people who are over controlling of their environment tend to be Freudian in nature. And so that's why it's still important to kind of cover these topics. The other thing we should take is the stage theory idea, that development occurs in stages. Okay. So let's then go on to another one. So Freud's theory is mainly a psychological theory. It gets on that psychological end of development, okay? This next theory gets on the cognitive end of development. So the next theory is about thought processes and how our thinking develops over time, how our ability to solve problems, to understand our world, language, all of those things are really what our next theory is about. And the person who probably is the forefront of this is Jean Piaget. Now, Piaget was not actually a psychologist. He was actually an ethnologist. He originally was actually interested in the imprinting of birds, okay? Because with a lot of bird species, the first adult that they see when they come out of the egg is going to be mom. Whether it is or not, that the little pigeon, I think he did pigeons and he did ducklings, and a few other species of birds. The very first adult feature that they come in contact with becomes their parent, becomes who they're going to follow. Okay. And he wanted to know if children also had this imprinting going on. Okay. Well, we do have some evidence for the idea of imprinting, which I'll get to later. But what he started to recognize in his research is that human beings are much more complex than ducklings and geese, and that the relationship of the mind is much more different and much more complex. But he kept, instead of thinking about the relationship, he continued to think about how thought processes evolve with human beings, okay? And he stressed that the interaction between the child and the world were important, that we actively construct and adapt to our environment. And we'll see how his theory actually shows that when we conclude with some concluding remarks. But he believed that we construct our world through two basic systems. The first one is a simulation, and the second one is accommodation. I don't think I have it here. Okay. A simulation is, for example, when you see a dog for the first time, and that dog looks unlike everything else, you have to create a new category that you're going to label that with. So that's a dog. Okay, that's a simulation. It's the development of new knowledge. Accommodation is when you have, for example, a dog, and then you have a cat come along, okay? And you notice both dogs and cats have 4 legs, they have a tail, they're fluffy, they have those ears, and they have whiskers, but they seem different. They seem like 2 different species. So accommodation is the implementation of something new, but realizing that it's something different. Okay, so you have 2 things. We can call them 4-legged animals, but one's a dog and one's a cat. Okay, and what we do with these through experience is develop what are called schemas. Okay, because we know not all dogs look the same, but they all have similar features. So a poodle looks different than a Rottweiler, that looks different than a pit bull, but we have a schema of a dog. And so we fit those, even though they look different, we fit them into those categories. Okay, so that's the basic construct of knowledge according to Piaget. All right. And he believed that development happens in 4 basic stages. Now, the difference between him and Freud is he's going to test each phase to see if there's something unique about each one. Okay. In the sensory motor phase, which lasts between 0 and 2, what Piaget argued is this is when an infant is learning that it exists within time and space, okay? And that it has the ability to interact with that time and space. And the most simple example is, for example, if an infant is using a bottle, it's the infant recognizing that bottle, being able to reach out and grab that bottle and put the bottle to his mouth. That's time, space, interaction. And that the infant has the ability to interact with the environment. So it's mostly about recognizing that sensory input and motor interaction kind of work together, okay? Now, at the time, I'm going to give Piaget's pure theory here. At the time, due to his limitations of technology and whatnot, the main test that he used to divide whether a child was still in the sensory motor phase, or if they're going on to a different unique phase, was what's called an object permanence experiment, okay? In an object permanence experiment, what Piaget found is that around 2 years, a child realizes objects still exist even when they're not in their sensory experience, okay? So kind of the classic study of this is Piaget would have a little child between the age of 0 to, well, not 0, that'd be too young, from about a year to about 3 years. And he would have a little curtain in front of the child, and he'd have the child's favorite toy. Maybe it's a teddy bear, right? And he would put the teddy bear in front of the child. And if the child was verbal, they would say, is this your teddy bear? Yes, blah, blah, blah. Non-verbal, they would see how much the child would interact with it. But then in front of the child, what Piaget would do, and this is the simplest task, is he would take the teddy bear and put it behind the curtain, okay? And again, ask the child, where's the teddy bear? And what Piaget discovered is that before the two years mark, most children would say, what teddy bear? What are you talking about, dude? Okay. After the age of 2, what the children would do is going, are you stupid? You put it behind here, and they go grab it. You know, like, you know, you didn't know what you did with it, I'll show you, kind of thing. Okay. And what Piaget thought is that this period of time is a transition period, because what that requires the child to do is to hold sensory information in their brain and recognize that just because it's not within their immediate sensory experience, that the object still exists and it's somewhere, okay? And yes, you know, if you're a really mean parent, you can really mess with your child. Take them to a babysitter, have the babysitter have brand new clothes and everything. And when you take the infant there, take off their clothes and put them in the new clothes, the new blanket, and leave so they can't smell you anymore. And yes, it is true that a lot of children have a lot of difficulty with this because they think mom and dad stopped existing. And if you want to give a babysitter a really horrible night, do that to them, because the infant will cry profusely. But on the good advice part, this is why when you do leave your infant with a child care provider or someone, make sure they have something that can sensorily remind them of you, like a blanket or some toy that you've interacted with, so that they recognize that mom and dad are still there. So that's just a little parenting advice based on Piaget and theory and findings, okay? So object permanence is this idea that we can hold information in our mind. And I think I stated this before, one of the most amazing things about children between the age of about 2 to 7 is they hold a lot of information in their brains. Between the age of 2 to 7, children are going to learn between 60 to 90,000 words. Now, I don't know about you guys, I don't remember that many words. And to be honest with you, I'm not sure how they measure it. But what happens after the age of 7 is we start to trim off the words we don't use, but we also start putting things in categories, okay? And so the pre-operational phase is about having the ability to put things in the mind and then start constructing categories for them to deal with the overwhelming sensory world that we exist in, okay? And so we recognize that this period is done by symbolic thought. If you really listen to children, how they explain things, they'll put it in very symbolic terms. This time period is also marked by something called irreversibility, okay? Irreversibility is the inability to understand that an object can be taken apart and put back together again, okay? And centrism and egocentrism, because of the stimulation that the child is going through, they feel like the world evolves around them, okay? And for Piaget and a lot of the cognitive theorists, they feel like that this occurs because of the overwhelming stimulation that the child is going through, okay? So that's pre-operation. And remember, it's all about symbolization. So in the first phase, it's all about our interaction with our world. And then we begin to represent the world with symbols, okay? The next phase is the concrete operational phase. And it's called concrete for very specific reasons, because this period of time is denoted by black and white thinking. Okay, if you talk to a lot of children, especially between 7 and 11, isn't that a store? Between the ages of 7 to 11, they're very black and white. There's bad people, there's good people. There's the color black, there's the color white. There's cops, there's robbers. And everything is very black and white, very concrete during this period of development, okay? And what is the child doing? They're taking all of the sensory information and they're putting it into hierarchical categories to make sense of their world, okay? So this is kind of the categorization period of development, okay? Now, what are some things that we notice between the transition between these two phases? And there's really kind of two basic tasks that a child is able to do. One is a conservation task, and the other is what's called the 3 mountain task. And it's something that during the time children between, again, about the age of 6 to 8, we see them being able to transition to being able to do these tasks. So what are they? I think I have examples. Let's start with the 3 mountain task. In the 3 mountain task, Piaget had a table. And as you can see by this figure here, there was a mountain. And on one side, there was a big tree. And on the other side, there was a smaller, slender tree, okay? And Piaget would sit on one side and the child would sit on the other. And a lot of times, because we know children, it would actually be the mother, not Piaget. And what the mother of Piaget would ask is, what does the child see? Okay. And if, he does this correctly, he says, well, I see a big tree, I see a mountain, then I see a small tree. So the child is accurately reporting that the child is seeing this kind of representative figure, okay? The transition and what Piaget was interested in is the next question. He would ask the child, what do I see, okay? Now, what he noted is that children under about the age of 6 would give Piaget the same answer. Is he would say, well, you see a big tree, you see a mountain, and behind the mountain, you see a small tree. But after about the age of 6, the child would say, no, wait a minute. No, actually what you see, I hope I get this right. Actually, what you see is this one right here, because you see a small tree, a mountain, and then a big tree. Okay, the opposite of what the child sees. And what Piaget found is that the transition phase was around the age of 6 to 7, where a child would start properly giving what Piaget is seeing instead of what the child is seeing. Now, what does this require a child to do? It requires a child, if we want to think about it, it's called mental rotation. It's the ability to take that table and in their brain, twist it around to take on the view of someone else, okay? So in the concrete phase, what we're seeing is the ability to mentally manipulate reality, mentally manipulate what a person is seeing in the environment, okay? And then there's another task that Piaget did. And back in the other one, it says the clay example. I can go over that, but one of the easier ones is the beaker task, where Piaget would have two same size beakers, okay, and we can label them A and B, and he would put the same amount of water in both of them, okay, and then in front of the child, he would dump cup B into another beaker that was different sized, okay. And so in the beginning, he would say, does A and B have the same amount of liquid? And of course, the child would say yes. And then in the last one, he would say, does A and C have the same amount of liquid? Okay. And again, what Piaget found is that children under the age of between 6 and 7 would say, no, there's either more or less water now. Okay. But children around the age of 6 and 7 start to understand that even though this is a different shape, the volume doesn't change. And so around the age of 6 and 7, children would say, no, it's still the same amount. Okay. The other example is Piaget would have two pieces of clay that are the same size. Okay, and he would say, are these the same amount? And I think they kind of look the same amount. And then he would take one of the pieces of clay and he would smash it. Okay, so he'd take this one and let's say he smashed it. And then he would say, are they still the same amount? And again, in this clay example, if the child was under the age of about 6 to 7, they would say, no, this is either more or less than this now. But if they're above the age of 6 and 7, they would appropriately say, no, they're still the same amount. They're just a different shape. Okay. And this is the notion of conservation, the ability to realize that mass can stay the same, but it can be shaped differently. Okay. And again, what does this require? This requires holding mental information in your mind and seeing that even though something is manipulated, it can still stay the same. In this example, that stays the same amount. Okay. So now that a child, if we go back to here, now that a child can hold information in their brain and they can mentally manipulate it, this is when they're able to put things in these hierarchical categories, okay? But again, these categories are going to become very fixed. There's going to be black and white. There's going to be good and bad. There's going to be cops and robbers, and that's it, okay? Very black and white thinking. Piaget then added the last stage of operations, which actually, I wish there was a task for this, but it's usually done through a logics test on a piece of paper. But then he has the formal operations phase, which happens around the age of 11, where people are able to think in the abstract. So they come to realize that example, a person can be in prison, but that doesn't mean that they're all bad. So not all criminals are bad people. They just made bad choices, and they come to realize that all cops aren't all good, that they can also have bad qualities. So it's that ability to see the gray in life, that black and white make gray, that bad and good are subjective, that people can do bad things, but they can still also do good things, and vice versa. Okay. And that's what's called formal operations thinking, is that ability to think within the abstract and not in those rigid categories. Okay. All right. So that's Piaget's 4 stages. And he argued in the Western model that what we should be achieving is formal operations. He argued that everyone makes it, but let's critique some of his model. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take it from a cross-cultural perspective, and we're going to run these tests across cultures. And we're going to find that there's differences, okay? I'm going to use Germany and the United States as an example, and I'm going to use a G for Germany and a U for United States in our slide, okay? About 90% of Germans make it to stage 4 development of formal operations, okay? Whereas here in the United States, only about 15% make it there. Most people in the United States are actually, about that other 85%, are actually, you only make it to stage 3, okay? Now, let's take this a step further. Let's take somebody within a more untouched indigenous society. So we're talking about individuals in the Amazon that are largely untouched by Western culture. Well, let's talk about individuals in the highlands of New Guinea that, again, have had little interaction with Western cultures or other forms of cultures, okay? In these environments, most of these individuals make it to about stage 2, but not stage 3 and 4, okay? So now the question is why? Why is it that in some cultures we make it to stage 2 and others, most of us make it to stage 3, and then in others make it to stage 4, okay? And this is the example of environmental demand. Is what we have learned is the environment determines the stage of development a person will get to or go to, okay? What do we know about the German culture that makes it so most of these individuals make it to the formal operations phase? Well, if we look at German history and compare it to United States history, one, it's a long history, and it's a history of being conquered and reconquered. We can bring up the whole issue of World War II, where a lot of people did a lot of bad things. And so their society, their culture, at least in the Western sense, and with modernization, is very complex in the abstract, that everything really is abstract for that type of culture. Here in the United States, I see this all the time on Facebook. So when they're talking about people crossing the borders, we're a country of law and order, okay? You break the law, you're a bad person. If you obey the law, you're a good person. We're a country of rules and laws. And for this society to function, everything is set in the black and white, okay? And so for a lot of Americans, stage 3 is where you need to be to navigate and survive within this given culture. Okay. Now, what about our Amazonians and our New Guinea individuals? Okay. If we think about where they exist in a dense jungle, in a place that sometimes is plentiful with resources and not plentiful with resources, and you really have to know what you need to eat and what you don't need to eat, okay? To survive in this kind of area, you need to have good sensory motor skills, and you need to have some symbolism that is very refined, okay? You don't need categorizations, and you don't need an understanding of abstractness. What you need in this environment to survive is the ability to recognize the objects within those quote unquote limited environments, okay? Now, the argument from a Western perspective is you would assume, well, does this make this individual less than these two? The answer is no, okay? Because I want you to think about, the general American or the general German, and if they go visit the Amazonian jungle, and I want you to think of what they need to take with them. They have to take technology, they have to take food, they have to take things to keep them warm, such as tents and everything else. And most of the time, they need indigenous guides. Otherwise, they don't survive, they die. They don't exist. So this is much more intelligent to have, much more survivability to have in that given environment, because these guys over here would not survive in that environment, okay? So when you're thinking about these stages, the one thing I do want everyone to get away from is that one stage is not more superior to the other one. It's just what the environment puts on that individual that determines the stage that is necessary for survival, okay? And that's what we've found cross-culturally. There's some other issues with Piaget's theory now that we have better technologies. Most of them center around stage 1 and stage 2, in that we are finding that infants categorize at a much younger age. We have found that, I think I mentioned this last time, I can't remember anything anymore, that infants are better at math than most adults. They're better at probability than most adults. They're better at more of this complex thinking than we've given infants credit for. And we have found that based on this, permanent objects probably happens at a much younger age. But what has been retained from Piaget's theory is, while a lot of the mental operations have kind of blurred, the idea of sensory motor involvement in locomotion has stayed pretty strong within this theory. So the idea of the sensory motor phase has still remained, but the complexity of thought has really changed our perceptions ever since we've been able to measure nonverbal behaviors and mental processes, okay? All right. Does Piaget make sense? You can put it in the chat. Is he okay with you? Okay, all right, all right. Okay. All right, so we're at 108. So the next theory we need to hit on, and we'll do this on Monday. We need to talk about a socio-emotional model. So we've talked about a cognitive model, a psychological model that is roughly based in biological development, but we still need to talk a lot more about biology. The next one is going to be a socio-emotional model, and it's going to be Erik Erikson's model. And just to give a preview, the other thing about Erikson's model is it's one of our first lifespan models. So he goes from infancy to late life, Okay. And he was a psychoanalytic, so he came out of the psychoanalytic Freudian camp, so he kind of retained this idea of conflict, and that conflict occurs at certain ages. His is based more on more naturalistic observation, and much like Piaget's, more testing. So it's a little bit more scientifically based than his, and we've had a lot of refinements to it. But his theory really emphasizes the interaction between people and others in their life, and how others in their life influence our development. So this will be our socio-emotional model that we'll go through, but we are just about out of time. And so let's go ahead and stop here for today. And I'll ask, does anybody have any questions? Okay. All right, hearing.
Oh, I'm sorry. Dr.
Go ahead,
Peterson.
Isabel.
I just had a quick question and out of curiosity. Why did Sigmund and Freud really focus on that like ancestral kind of thought-filling fantasy between the children and the parents? Was that like common in that era, or why was that like a thought?
So Isabel, mainly he focused on the sexual aspect, and almost, as you mentioned, the incestuous aspect for a couple reasons. One is he developed his theory before he developed his developmental theory. So he was forced to bring human sexuality into his developmental theory. There's rumors that he originally didn't want it to be that way, but it did end up that way. The other aspect, as you're getting to, is the aspect of time and place in which Freud was doing his work. Again, Freud worked with a lot of adults who were molested as children. He worked with a lot of rape victims and a lot of rape offenders. And what he came to see within his clientele is, one, a lot of his incest clients, what was incest between the parent and the child. And the other thing that he recognized is it seemed like adults who were sexually assaulted, at least in his clinical view, the ones that really struggled with it, you could go back to that relationship they had with their parent, and really, in his mind, I'll tell you, I disagree with this, given the technologies and our knowledge now, is that he felt that it had to deal with that relationship with mom or dad. Okay, so a couple reasons. One, one was because of his theory that he developed, and two was because of his clinical experience working with adults who had been abused as children. So, but he assumed that that his theory applied to everyone, not just his clinical population. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. All that background information just helps me a lot more. Thank you.
Yeah, good. And Mercedes, I agree with you. I like Piaget's theory much better than Freud's, because again, I just want to emphasize, one of the reasons we teach Freud is because he introduced stage theory, and two, he still has a lot of popular culture stuff with his theories. So we talked about, all of those, but Piaget's was much more neutral in a sense. He did it a lot more scientifically, and didn't use his own assumptions about life and whatnot. And it wasn't based on a clinical population. Piaget's theory was based on observations of the general population of children. So that's another reason I think I prefer Piaget's. But do keep in mind, Piaget's is just a cognitive theory. It's the development of thought. Freud's is more of a psychological theory of why we behave the way we do. And the next theory is a socio-emotional one, how the interaction with our social world influences our development. So they differ on quality and but also content. Okay. All right, everyone. Well, let's get out of here. Have a wonderful day, and we will see you all on Monday.